Welcome, Molly.
Yay.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here.
Thanks for coming. I think we bumped into your pieces, I think, several times organically, and I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. I
Somebody
think
suggested.
we were reading it actually on a previous lunch break. So sometimes on lunch break we just stick interesting articles into Google Docs and then like go in and highlight and read together. So we
Yes.
were reading this piece a couple of weeks ago, I think when Dylan tweeted about it. I think that's how I saw it. But super relevant to like so many things we love talking about. So really glad that we got you looped in.
That makes me super excited to hear. Yeah, so much to talk about. It's funny because doing this piece, I thought that it wasn't going to be super relevant to like many people because it seems like a very niche area. But I feel like it's coming out more and more that it actually has like much broader appeal, which was a pleasant surprise for me.
Yeah. How did you, so this was your undergraduate thesis, right?
It was, yeah. It
Nice.
was
How
not
did you end
required.
up start getting curious about this stuff?
Yeah. I think it started a long time ago. I've always been very interested in like how we can foster creativity in human beings more broadly. And the context for like being interested in software is more stemming from growing up like pirating Photoshop and just being very into creative tools as like the main piece of software that I was just in on a day-to-day basis, which is kind of weird actually if I look back on it. But I really liked them and I had a Wacom tablet and I saw firsthand in myself like how much I could do with it and the level of expression that I could get out of like interacting with the computer in that way. So I don't know, it kind of inspired me to study digital media in some ways. It inspired me to like pursue design and graphic art and things of that sort. So I think when it came time to choose my undergraduate thesis, I was very interested in at first building something, some kind of like digital creative tool, until I realized how much work that would be, and also just that I didn't think that I had much to contribute in that area yet. Versus research within like an academic context where you're provided a lot of support and just the resources, and you can play the student card. It felt more, honestly, more valuable to me personally for myself, and then also I felt like I could share more in that medium and it would be, I don't know, it had more reach versus my tiny little like software project probably would not.
Yeah. And how did you go about when you were researching, like where did you find kindred spirits who are also thinking about these things?
Hmm.
In, like across time. So I was really fascinated by some of the people that you referenced. And I said in chat, I think intertwingularity is now my favorite word. But also, yeah, like where did you find your people right now today thinking about these things? Like I think a lot of builders are thinking, I mean, obviously relevant to like Figma and Replit and a bunch of
Yeah,
things we talk about here.
totally. I think a lot of it is reading. Just like finding good books. I think honestly like design Twitter and just like the ambient environment of being online, you kind of pick up on a lot of the different historical references and things of that sort that are kind of, they can just pass you by, or you can dig a little bit deeper and then it kind of leads to another thing and another thing, and then you talk to a couple people and they are like, oh, you should read this. It's a very like networked effect that suddenly like you're the person that people just keep sending links to. And I think that
Yeah.
that's a really good place to be if you're interested in these topics, and especially like doing research is just kind of asking questions of people and seeing where it goes, because once you start asking the questions, I feel like they just keep growing and you get more of them, and then other people have questions for you and it just gets much more interesting very quickly. So, and I think the internet also is like very amazing for that. Like I would not have been able to probably dig as deep or come to as interesting of the conclusions as I did had I not been like surrounded by other people thinking about these things and actually acting on them too, which is like the interesting part there.
Have those kind of new behaviors that have emerged around people sending you links and around you collaborating with thought partners in new ways, has that sort of inspired like new workflows or use cases with existing kind of tools for thought, or new tools for thought that you're adding to your repertoire to help you organize some of that chaos?
Yeah, I mean like specific software, is that what you mean?
Yeah, or workflows like I'm just thinking of I'm thinking of like tools I've tried in the past. Like in the past, I used to try to use Pocket because I felt like, oh, like all these links are coming at me and I kind of need to like put them somewhere. And now I
Yeah.
kind of use browser tabs and I don't always revisit them. I wouldn't say that I have like a product or a workflow that, at least for me, feels like has this like Zen satisfying completionist, like that's how I do it. I just feel like I'm
Mhm.
in a bit of a swirl. And I'm wondering if, given that you may have experienced that, I wonder if you've sort of gotten out the other end with clarity on like tools or workflows that help you.
Yeah, no, I'm in the same club as you. I
Okay.
feel like there's not that many, just honestly good tools or like even understanding in how people deal with links. Or to reframe that, I think that there are tools, but they're not as adaptable to like the many different ways that people think about these sources and links and research,
Mm-hmm.
and also what they're doing with it and how they want to consume it. So I I probably tried like everything during this project, and I continue to. I think the one that I continue coming back to is probably the Notion web clipper, which I am biased, but I do think it's like, for the way that I do research, it's nice to just have it in like a simple database and then go back to it later. And I like the way that it scrapes the page. But I've also tried like Arena and like putting it in a to-do list, making docs,
Mm-hmm.
all the things. And it's very context specific too. Like if I plan to share it, then I'm definitely going to care more about the formatting than if I don't.
Right. In
Yeah.
the Notion web clipper workflow, are you web clipping to kind of your own private Notion, or
Yeah.
is that part of a collaborative process at all, or does that
It
collaboration or
can
sharing
be.
comes later?
Yeah, I used to have my I call it my file cabinet, and it's just a whole bunch of database rows of things that I found on the internet that interested me and I thought I might want to come back to. And I have like shared that with people, but there's just so much in there. And looking back, I'm kind of like, sometimes I look at the links and I'm like, maybe let's not share this publicly, just because things that I
Mhm.
don't completely endorse, like they're just a
Right.
bunch of different perspectives.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm down to try anything. I think that this is a problem worth working on that I have not found a great solution to yet.
Mm-hmm. Are you a member of? I mean, just this whole problem space fascinates me. So I wonder, are you a member of
Yeah.
any like existing? Maybe it's like a Slack community where it's not fully public the way we have on Twitter, but it's more private. But there may be shared resources. Maybe where the kind of like web clipping idea could be shared into
Mhm.
maybe some sort of a semi-private kind of Slack situation. Is that something that you've bumped into?
I've bumped into that a little bit. Maybe not in the context of like a Slack community, but I've definitely like shared out links and database views and things like that to people and been like, hey, just take a look. There's a lot here,
Mm-hmm.
but like you'll find a couple things that you're probably interested in related to certain topics. I think that's the nice thing too, is that you can like filter by views and then you can just sort with tags. But yeah, I'm a spokesperson for the Notion web clipper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I was also wondering, these themes are very resonant, and I really liked some of the examples that you gave, like whether it was digital audio workstations or like talking about the Jordan Singer GPT-3 thing that was crazy. But
Yeah.
well, two questions. I was wondering what could or should be simpler out of this section where you're talking about abstracting complexity and increasing efficiency. Like thinking about what are the areas of greatest friction and complexity right now.
Hmm.
And also trying to think about like concrete examples where like what are tools that people are working on building, or I mean Vidi's in the audience, we should get him up later. He knows all about digital audio workstations. But just kind of like, are there any other interesting things that have popped up while you were writing this or since you've written this, in terms of projects people are working on that you find inspiring?
Oh yeah. Oh, so many. I'm sure I'm not going to do them justice, but I think, yeah, the area that where I talk about like abstraction and efficiency, it's a hard one because it's really just like two conflicting things. And my point is really that tools should adapt to the different phases of the creative process and either increase or decrease the complexity to kind of make space for the human innovation that can happen in that space when it's not like completely preoccupied with choosing the color of a rectangle when it does not matter. You're just like trying to put a sticky note on a canvas. And I think that's the main area that I think I see as being a hindrance to creativity in like any tool across any creative process, is just probably like at the ideation stage, most tools should dramatically decrease the complexity and make it very quickly easy to get started. And that's the part that I think is missing from most tools today, is that they just assume that you come in with a fully fledged idea and you just immediately start making it. And almost no one works that way, which is kind of crazy that we have not, like addressed this more readily. And I think that we have by creating completely separate products. Like we have whiteboarding tools and things of that sort. And that does address the need, but also then it runs into the other problem of, if the tools can't talk to each other, which is like my first point, then it's no good to be working in one tool for ideation and then moving on to like assembly, and you have to like recreate what you made. Like this is just very clearly a terrible process. And I think that, like the example of digital audio workstations it's a difficult one for people to wrap their heads around, because I think everyone has such different experiences with those tools, and people are very opinionated about them. And it's funny that I wrote that, and I still stand by that point, that I think that they are a good example of being able to shape the tool to your needs and kind of abstracting away complexity in some ways, and then also just accommodating however you want to use it. But I also think that they're like one end of the spectrum where they just kind of allow you to do whatever. Kind of, there's constraints, but they want to allow you to bring in your own workflow, basically replicating the physical process of being in a studio. And then you can just do that in the software. And it's almost like they continue to do that because they're still trying to gain more users to come to the digital processes. It's like the top of funnel that they never started closing, because it's still, they're still like adapting people, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's the way that they think about it, but that's how I've contextualized it in my mind. But I don't know. I also can kind of get behind the point that maybe it's the other end of the spectrum, and digital audio workstations are, in that way, very constrictive, and they're actually limiting a lot of possibility because they're not showing you the most efficient way. They're just letting you do whatever. And that, in some ways, is like limiting creative possibility, because you're not getting streamlined to the most important parts, and you're possibly just meandering around. So I don't know.
It touches on a general form that we've discussed on lunch breaks before, which I find fascinating for software, which is anytime you have a very horizontal piece of software, you kind of don't know exactly what to do with it, because it just like does everything. It's just kind of like a computing primitive almost. Yeah. And then anytime you have like a strongly embodied workflow, it's so highly structured that it makes one thing efficient, but maybe you don't want to do that thing right now, or maybe that thing doesn't quite apply to your use case. So I've been intrigued by like from a product builder's perspective, being able to say, let's try to make the tool as abstract as possible. And then separate from the tool, let's actually build templates that help identify a few use cases that are less structured in nature. And I think, one example, I think like the Airtable team has done a good job of building what is effectively looks kind of like just a database. And then they built a bunch of templates that help you use it for, I don't know, setting up an ATS or something like that. So I think that general style, I would, I'd almost like to see more kind of tool builders, sort of bimodally distribute across, focus on the horizontal as the horizontal, and then make templates to solve the verticals, and don't confuse the two. You know what I mean?
I totally know what you mean. I think that's a really good point. I think that you see that more and more today, and it's exciting. It's cool to see how people are building tools that are multi-purpose and moldable, and then relying more on the community to come up with like the exact use cases of how they want to use it, and then just really like investing in those. I think that's very interesting. I think it's kind of hard to get off the ground sometimes, but it also is really powerful.
Yeah.
Templates are so important. I think that one of the um, very underrated and undervalued parts of onboarding people to a product and getting them to adopt it is really just like always populating the blank canvas or whatever it happens to be, because that is the part that like keeps people away. And templates are so good at like addressing that exactly. So it was interesting to see how different companies are doing that to greater or lesser extents. It seems to be, yeah,
Do you have
much more readily
any
adopted.
recent examples that kind of come to mind that you think are done really well?
Yeah, so many. Airtable, like you mentioned, I think is a very good example. I think Figma community is a good example. Um, I think Notion in some ways, and we're working on it, is a good example of this.
What are some
And
of the early? We're familiar with Notion, but I wasn't familiar with the template ecosystem. So, are there a couple really nice templates that you'd suggest? People don't know how to engage with Notion, like a good starting point template.
yeah, I mean, I think that like the in-product templates are a good starting place if you're a team. If you are more of a personal user and you want dashboards and things like that, we do have a template gallery. It is hosted on Notion, but it does have plenty of great things there. And I think that that's a good place to just honestly broaden your expectation of what the tool can do, which is what good templates do.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that those are some good starting places. And some of my personal favorites are just like note taking and dashboard and things of that sort. They're great to just very quickly kind of dump a lot of ideas in a structured format.
Oh, cool. I shared a link to the Notion template gallery in chat. So it looks like there's like a nonprofits collection of templates, a startups collection of templates, remote work templates. So it's nice that they're sort of curated and organized by type. So they're
Yes.
easy to find like a starting point.
Yeah. Relevant to education as well, because I think about like the computer science classes that I took, for example, were very much focused on like you read the textbook or watch a lecture about how some concept applies, and then you go like open your blank like Java console
Yeah.
or whatever, and you're like, like how do I write? How do I even start? There's this just moment of like panic and emptiness. But what if instead you were just like, here are 5 templates for like the beginnings of a couple different projects, and like have the lesson kind of overlaid, but let the person, I feel like people who teach themselves how to code do it this way.
Yeah.
It's more adapting and like layering upon previously existing work. Whereas in the university ecosystem right now, it seems like that's more seen as like plagiarism or like impure, or at least in like the homework test context.
Yeah. You could not be more right. It's funny too, because I think that like that's 100% true, and yet everyone in CS degrees is usually like ripping things off of GitHub. Like the culture is still very like making the most of building upon each other's work, but it's just not widely recognized. It's more like underground. This is what happens when they
Yeah.
don't kind of adequately create the curriculum in a way that is like building upon pre-existing knowledge. It's always forcing you to like start from scratch. It's pretty ridiculous, but
Yeah.
I've heard it termed CCP engineering, cut copy paste engineering.
I've heard that cracks me up. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that makes total sense. Also, like to the point of GitHub and open source stuff, I saw that you referenced like Nadia's work um, in this, because a lot of people kind of just hail that as the be all end all answer, and then you don't realize that there are a lot of like social relationships and kind of organizations to figure out how to make an open source project actually function. Like who is maintaining and who has responsibility for like decisions that are made at different levels of that process.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, or like what were your reactions when you were reading some of her stuff?
Huge fan of her stuff. I think her work is really incredible, and it really was pretty groundbreaking, at least for me personally. I think, yeah, growing up, I always thought like, oh, well, the opposite end of the spectrum of this very like closed software environment that we find ourselves in is obviously open source, and that has been hailed as like the solution to a lot of software problems for a long time. At least from like a more counterculture perspective and lens. But I think reading her book for me was very much like, we're encountering the same problems that we're seeing in our current system. It's just translated to a smaller scale, and it's underground, and it is really just like the lack of, I don't know. To me, it always points to our society being really bad at recognizing important work that might not directly fit into like a business's goals, and I think open source is a really good example of that. And it's just really unfortunate. I think that there's still a lot of potential for open source. It definitely, when I was writing this, it didn't cause me to write it off in any way as like a piece of a solution to some of the problems that we see. Which I will preface by saying, I think that most of the problems that we see in like digital creative tools, they're not like huge problems. Like we've come really far and they're really good. And like the extent to collaboration and everything that we see today is really incredible. But I think that they can still do better. So that's like the inspiration. And I think that doing better in some parts is like definitely just trying to find ways for people to feel more ownership and more just control over their tools in a way that will mean that they will invest and contribute to the community and just be a part of the tool's evolution. And I think that there's been companies too where, especially in like the instance of scripting languages and things like that, where people really are contributing and those communities really are like valuable and they're not asking too much of the people that run them. Not always true, but sometimes true. But I don't know. Yeah, I think open source is part of a broader solution, but it's not the be all end all like we all hoped for so long.
I think one of the things that open source does well that you talk about sort of the idea of interoperability, and I think open source sets a little bit of a foundation for what the interfaces or APIs might be, or sort of collects people around a set of common, say, beliefs or understanding because an open source project works a certain way. But I wonder, is, in your mind, is the kind of private business need a major reason that we don't have the interoperability more pervasive throughout software? Or, is that, I guess there's sort of headwinds and tailwinds. It could also help with innovation to be able to, run it in a new way and define your own interfaces. So I wonder if sort of you have like a strong view on sort of what we could be doing to encourage more of that.
Yeah, this is like the main thing that I think about, because I think for this project, the main, like, of the 3 points, the main one that I'm willing to die on is definitely the interoperability one. It's a bummer that it's not particularly just enticing or exciting to most people because it's pretty invisible work. But I think that, to your point, definitely from my vantage point, it goes against most business incentives, which is very unfortunate, but just acknowledging the fact that paying for a tool to allow their users to leave the tool and go to another tool at their own will is pretty clearly like in opposition to the business incentives as they're currently structured. Obviously, there's work that we can do to like change that so that there is incentive, but it also would require all of the software companies to agree to standards and maintain them. And in our competition-driven business environment, that does not sound particularly plausible to me. But I think that there is ways that it can be framed that would, I don't know, appeal to these companies in some way. I think that it would probably require just like a lot of wordsmithing and finagling to frame it in a way that is basically like, hey, this is going to, we can build upon each other's like innovations. We can, create these incredible things together. Come on, let's all get in and let's just do it. But I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because I feel like we've talked about this a little bit in terms of art and NFTs and the metaverse, and like a lot of people are talking about some version of interoperability as applied to gaming, for example. Like if different game producers made like skins or cosmetics or features of their games kind of transferable between different game ecosystems. And in those cases, it seems like one benefit is that you get broader exposure to your original like game and tool, especially as a newer creator. Maybe this is where it gets tough for bigger companies to really be sold. But I wonder if, yeah, I don't know. I wonder if this will come mostly from bottoms up. If it's a little harder thinking of it in terms of like interoperability with something so at such a foundational level as opposed to like, you know, cosmetics or more easily like chunkable things that are part of a game. But I'm just thinking out loud about some of the incentives that seem to apply in that context, and like would they also be applicable in other contexts, or how could we use them and kind of change the narrative around interoperability here?
Totally.
Yeah, the game context is interesting, and I think we heard some suggestion that it works well for kind of the mid-market games that want to bind together. So I wonder if the opportunity is similarly in platforms. You know, if you've got a really large platform and you're already kind of, you know, dominant in a category, you probably don't have an incentive to, you know, interrupt much. But it may be that like the next wave of kind of platforms that want to serve people in various ways would actually get benefit from being able to bind together, and through that interop, they like as an ecosystem they can compete better. You know, and you mentioned kind of how interop is both your, you know, kind of, you know, the hill you'll die on, and maybe the least kind of appreciated or visible. And I actually wonder if, you know, I don't think we have quite the right answers for how all of the decentralized tools of the internet would work, but I think there's a lot of energy at least going towards this. And I think decentralized tool makers and service, call it, I don't know, ecosystems, seem like it feels like it's kind of, you know, it rhymes with interoperability in certain ways, because you want to remove control from, you know, you want to remove like dependencies and controls from any given provider. You kind of want to like go to the provider that happens to serve the specific need you have best and kind of on the most reasonable terms. So I wonder if like there's aspects in the decentralization ecosystem that you've already become aware of, you know, people attempting things in decentralized ways that may, you know, that may start to play on some of the interop themes that you're passionate about.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really interesting parallel. Totally true. I know it makes me start to think like, how can they work together? And I don't know if they can. But there's definitely something there about decentralized platforms and tools that work together, and just like making it more of a collaborative experience in general and not bound to one tool, I think is very powerful across the board, however you slice it. And I hope it happens more.
Yeah, I wanna get VD up because I don't know if you guys know each other already, but he's building an app that is super relevant to all of this. And are you there?
Digital
VD?
audio workstation, in fact.
It's a video. Yeah, exactly.
Hey, what's up? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, tell us.
Hi.
You've been sharing a bunch of interesting links
good.
in chat.
I actually haven't finished reading the blog post, but I'm super intrigued.
Amazing.
But so Vidhi, how do you think about, you also had this comment on our live read about how Ableton is a really interesting example of like two things happening in one ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah. I don't know if you've experimented with Ableton session mode. It's basically, I don't know if DK's tried it. I know you make music. So it's basically like, if you look at DAWs, they're meant for like composing music, where you like go to the studio, record stuff, put everything together, and like finish the song. But what Ableton has done is you can kind of make music live, like playing an instrument. So you can just like add a bunch of samples to the soundboard, and then you can just hook up like each sample to a MIDI like key, and then just play it. And that's really interesting because like, you know, and a lot of musicians kind of use this for live performances. And the cool thing about it is it kind of feels like an instrument rather than, I don't know if there's a lot of background noise. But the thing that's interesting about it is it kind of feels like you're playing an instrument. which is the most like natural way to make music. And we're all used to making music like that. And it kind of creates like this immediate feedback loop where you're playing something and then you hear it and then you change and then you add effects. And I think but yeah, I think that's interesting. I don't know, like it just leads to more happy accidents, and you don't have to like have an idea of what you want to make before you come into it. You can just like start making stuff and experiment.
That's awesome. No, I totally agree. I think that there's something really interesting about the way that Ableton specifically has kind of like decided not to go the route of just replicating like the studio environment and all the tools that you would find in a physical space, and they've instead really leaned into like, let's digitize it and really just like see what can happen and really try to like tap into the power of computers, really, in that they can allow you to assign individual things and like replicate them in a really interesting way, and basically just like extreme abstraction for yourself and like making that abstraction yourself, which is a really interesting concept too.
Yeah, I also think the whole like idea of templates is super interesting. The way we're looking at it at Bounce is like before we had specific templates that people could use to start making music, but then we were like, hey, what if like every song is a template, and then if you like a song, you can just like take it and turn it into your own thing. So I guess it's more remixing at the end of the day, but yeah, I don't know. That's something I wanted to add.
How do you think about I noticed in the piece, Molly, when you were talking about digital audio workstations, I think you pointed to them as like a shining example of, was it a particularly shining example around moldability? Maybe it was.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I was trying to understand, is that an example that, is there something about the moldability that, I'm trying to contrast it with something like Excel or Google Sheets. Is there something about sort of the workflows that are more directed in something like Google Sheets versus a digital audio workstation?
In my mind, yes. And I realize that I think some people would like to fight me on this, which is totally fine, because I think that there's many ways of viewing these tools. I think in the way that I see it, digital audio workstations accommodate a lot of different workflows, even the ones that are more abstracted and more presumptive about how much digitalness you want in your process. They still are like let you do things many different ways. Like you can have so really diverse workflows of using these tools, and you can start in one place or you can start in a completely different place, and then you can end up at the same product, which is like an outputted file or something of that sort. And in that way, I see them as pretty moldable because they allow you to just kind of take so many different paths. There's definitely like arguments that are totally valid that they are not actually, and that's partly what pushes people away from them, and sometimes, especially like in the case of Ableton and some other tools that are more new. But I still think that like contrasting it with Google Sheets, which basically just lets you pop in, start adding some text. It's very like, you have to add text, you have to add something. That's your starting place. You don't really have a ton of options. Versus digital audio workstations, you can start constructing your environment, you can start adding things, or you can start like creating like the backbone of it. There's just much more like flexibility there, which is kind of my point for why more creativity can be born from that flexibility, from my perspective. But it's definitely like, there's so few examples of this that I'm not, it's less defensible than I thought it was when I was writing it.
Cool.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting also to think about different domains. Like we've talked a little bit about music, and then Google Sheets, I don't know what you would call that, like rudimentary analysis or something.
Yeah.
But like writing, obviously Google Docs was one of the first kind of collaborative multiplayer examples that you talked about. But we've also talked a lot on Lunchbreak since then about what are different like ecosystems and ways of collaborating on writing that would be much better, and maybe like unearth more process, and like maybe even be more GitHub-like in terms of like seeing specific points where things were merged or ideas were debated or whatever. Yeah. How do you think about, I mean, as someone who wrote this entire thing and probably writes a lot, how do you think about making the process of writing more collaborative and and like better fostering creativity. Also, I posted a link a little earlier, but I think what James Yu is doing with his experiments, here's the link again, kind of using GPT-3 to help templatize or spark a little bit of creativity when someone's kind of starting from a blank slate or at a writer's block point is interesting in this context as well.
Totally. I want to check that out after. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think as someone who wrote this whole thing in Google Docs, I'm a fan. It's like obviously kind of the industry standard for collaboration, and just I think that there's something to be said for using the tool that the most people will feel comfortable in, which is at this point Google Docs. And that's kind of the route that I took. But I definitely think that there's a lot more that could be done to just make people feel more comfortable contributing beyond just like comments. I think that that is the part that I keep coming back to, is like, I know that they have features for suggestions and things of that sort, but that's much more like farther down the line in editing perspective, versus how about just like riffing on ideas and like spinning up an alternate sentence or adding some comments that are like really high level. Like, how do you do that? You end up like adding them to maybe the beginning, like the title of the doc or something that's like really odd.
Yeah.
Step back. And I think, I don't know, there's some interesting ideas here around just going back to the physical process that it's replicating. Like, how can we make people feel like they're like slapping a sticky note on your work or something like that?
Yeah.
Or that there's like tracing paper or something that is like protecting them from actually harming someone else's ownership over their property and ideas, but they're contributing and it's safe to do so. And that's honestly kind of like a social problem more than it is anything else. Like, that is us as human beings, like acclimating ourselves to a digital environment and figuring out like what our standards and processes are there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think that probably Google Docs and writing tools in general are like the most high impact from my vantage point, because the most people are using them. And they also are just the most straightforward. Like, it's writing. It's just one medium. It's not like images and photos and text. It's just, I mean, you can have those, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't know what they're doing. I haven't seen like incredible examples of this yet, but I'm curious if either of you have.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that we keep addressing again and again here on Lunchbreak that we're super passionate about. I think actually one of our guests had a really interesting framing of this idea that I'll share here because it may help spark some thought. So this gentleman, have you ever met Chris Pyack from Pace Capital? Have you seen his? He has a piece called Frameworks v0.2.
Yeah, and stuck it in chat also.
It's basically a Google Doc, but it's meant to be somewhat of like a collaborative blog post, more so than sort of just a doc, let's say. And the way he described it, he sort of said like all of human ideas, or all potential ideas might be this big ocean of water. And once we figure out something that we know, like 1 + 1 = 2, that becomes like ice in the ocean. And we kind of are continually expanding this frontier where there's kind of this slush gathering around this ice chunk, and we're sort of growing. And so when he writes on Medium and he posts something, he feels like he's writing it in ice, and it's meant to be like thought of by the audience as part of human knowledge, which is not his intention. He actually wants to do most of his writing in this kind of slush area. And so Google Docs turns out to be a great tool, kind of as you were pointing out, sort of the social behavioral thing, but Google Docs indicates to the reader, like, this is active, these are question marks, these are like ideas in progress versus ideas that are like ice. And so I wonder if you have thought about ways to take kind of the Google Docs metaphor and help people collaborate on writing, and sort of, at what point do we think of things as published and when do we think of them as work in progress? Or is everything a work in progress? And does that relate to other tools that you're sort of playing with, or something, maybe how you think about the writing process?
Oh, big questions, big philosophical questions. I think honestly, from my vantage point, this is kind of the next frontier for tools, is really trying to, especially creative tools, allow in more collaborators from different backgrounds, not just the ones that the tool was originally intended for. And in doing so, like really being forced to reckon with how we conquer those like social anxieties and the blockers that keep people from feeling comfortable in these tools. And I think a lot of them are just like creating better features for allowing people to feel like their contributions are acknowledged, they're harmless, they're really just like off the cuff thoughts. They're not like set in stone, this is my cold hard feedback.
Right.
And I don't actually know like what the best way to solve this. I don't think that there are many shining examples of this. To be totally honest, I think Google Doc comments are interesting and they kind of get at this. They don't feel particularly heavy or insurmountable, but they're very temporary and they definitely signal at, hey, this is a work in progress, like I'm still figuring things out. And how do we like scale that to different phases of the creative process where it's actually published and you're looking for hearing people's responses to your work? That doesn't really fit into the context of a Google Doc comment anymore. Like there's something different that's there. And like what does that look like? I'm not sure. I think that if you look to like what it's replicating in the physical environment, it's much more like a note or an email or something like that. A more long form response that is kind of articulated. And yeah, I'm curious. I'm very curious to see like how we tackle this, both in written tools and then also I think in creative tools. I think that there's something interesting, creative tools in the sense of like more visual. Like how can we do this in design tools is like an interesting thing too. I think comments are obviously very helpful there, but then also when you're looking at it from like a higher level, when you're examining the greater need, like how can you provide functionality that lets people have like better conversations and people from many different like verticals and backgrounds can go in and they can just be like, I wonder about this. And then they can actually like indicate how, first, how much they care about this, what type of comment it is, and have that actually be received in the right way by the person who made it. I think that's like the hardest thing is like, I think people have some really interesting workarounds currently to like make sure that people receive feedback in the way that they intend it. It's often like people framing something as like a nit or something like that, like a small comment or this is like an open question or things like that. And it's really fascinating. People adapt to the tools and they try to like make them work and preserve those like co-working relationships and even not co-working. But it's definitely, it could be so much better. Yeah.
And so much of it also reminds me a little bit of the conversation thread on like Nadia's work in open source software, because as you mentioned, so much of it is social. Like if you have a Google Doc author who is super active and like tagging a bunch of people in and like being really welcoming when people have comments and sort of being like the good host kind of the dinner table, then that can probably like unlock a huge cascading series of kind of collaboration and stuff. So even apart from like how we think about how we should change or build upon the tools we have, also thinking about just the norms changing and why writing like yours is important and people having conversations around this more and more in public, because so much of it is also just like unlocking this hesitancy or like fear of judgment probably.
Totally. No, I couldn't agree more. I think that's so true. And yeah, it's like, it's very clearly not always, the onus is not on the tool to solve these problems. It's oftentimes it's actually more the humans and like the individual needs of the little ecosystems and community that these works are springing up in. But that's like a lot of unseen work that like whose responsibility is it? I think that we're also still figuring out and also valuing it and actually treating it as something that is vital to like creative collaboration, especially like at scale, and also just like documenting these things. I don't see that happening very often, or it only appears in like very small groups and very informally. I don't know. I mean,
that's a good point. Yeah.
It's an interesting problem. And I don't think that like the solution is necessarily just like tons more documentation on feedback, which is like, who's going to read that? But it does become more and more important. So we'll see.
That's
Are there
interesting. It also reminds me of the way that people talk about like the creator economy and sort of monetizing fans is something that came up when we were talking to Gabby Goldberg. Just if we change the incentives for providing feedback, not only like social norms easing and making people feel more welcome when they present feedback, but also being like more formally maybe acknowledged as collaborators or co-creators with some like prestige marker, or I don't know if it's money or what it would be to kind of keep the spirit the right thing. But yeah, I feel like it kind of touches on this theme of like fan as co-creator or like internet as at large as like editor and collaborator. I'm not really sure when you make it the line between like making it cold and transactional and then like open and sort of this frothy environment is tricky though.
Yeah. I'm all for just like any way we can make the internet and these tools more human is great. I think we need more of that. And that might be also a response to just like how we're living now, but I think we're all running into it and just realizing that this is not, we're missing something here. It's not working great.
are there tools or areas where you would gather today with, I think, we've mentioned like Nadia in her book a bit in her work. I wonder, would there be a place where you would typically talk to her, discuss with her, write with her? Are there other people that are kind of in a similar thought space that might be able to, participate in that kind of space? Or, I don't know if any of this stuff already exists or you've found communities.
I wish. No, none that I know of or am involved in. I think for me, like the main communities that I've tapped into are more like just young people in tech being optimistic and trying to articulate what it is that we're looking for that we're not finding. I think, which is mainly like exists on Twitter and in group chats, sadly. But I hope that there's more of that. And I think that you see it more in just like the mainly B2B startups that are popping up, usually founded by young people these days, where people are just talking about these things and they're reaching out and trying to like gain a perspective from the people who are going to be using them for the next probably 30 years. Because I think we also have very different perspectives on tools than many of the people that are ahead of us. And there is much more of an expectation for collaboration and kind of open sourcing ideas and just testing them out in the wild very early. So it's very informal. I hope it becomes maybe a little bit more structured, but it's also cool to see just how fluid people are becoming with their ideas and how much they really want to gut check them many, many times.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious when you mentioned sort of the kind of the newer generation of tool builders who are building for these new use cases, new expectations. Are there things like if you sort of had the ear of the older generation and you were going to try to explain how why people should think about things in a different way? Are there certain things that maybe that feel like it's something that old people do that you want to coach them into like a new way to think about things? This is like maybe I'm the old guy here in Mishti. They're trying to get me to they're trying to get me to write in lowercase, and I'm like, oh, it like hurts, but like I get this.
No punctuation. Never use a period when you're texting.
Never. It's a mortal sin.
Yeah.
Oh man. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I think that the main thing that I see happening is the line between creator and collaborator is becoming increasingly blurred. Like you guys already mentioned, I think that is a really pertinent point, especially in the context of like everything that's happening in the movements like the creator economy and things like that. But I think that beyond that, I think ownership is also just becoming really blurry. And we see that everywhere. And I think that in the context of creative tools, that's a really interesting problem to be dealing with, because obviously tools and computers, they want to assign ownership, and like everything has a single truth to it. And dealing with that and applying the changing social norms about creative work to tools is like going to become increasingly relevant. And I think there's a lot of like ways that we can solve that, and we already kind of see it happening where it's just more everything is out in the open, like shared files, things of that sort. But I think that if I had to like tell the past generation what to look out for, it's probably that of just like ownership is less of a thing. We're all just kind of building upon each other's ideas. Nothing is new. Like everything is just kind of recreating and building upon past experiments. And I'm optimistic about that personally. I think that there's a lot to be gained by looking at the history and really trying to understand like how we got here. And I think that my generation in general is like fascinated by looking at the history and maybe taking a little bit more of a respectful approach to acknowledging the challenges and wins and successes and failures of the past, but then also looking forward and saying, how can we apply this? I think that tech is an interesting industry because it is so new, and for so long, tech culture has kind of been a lot about rejecting the the history and institutions and kind of relishing in what can happen in the safe space where you can just run really fast and in so many different directions and see what kind of sticks. But I think we're getting to the place where we're big enough and we have proven to ourselves that we have impact, and we need to start looking a little bit more long term and really considering like how we got here and how we can make things better. Not that they're necessarily bad, but just that there is a lot of room to grow and we'll be here for a while. So that's my off the cuff wisdom to the
yeah. Kind of branching off that, we always like to wrap by asking people what they're most curious about or their biggest questions now for the world. And so if you had like unlimited time and resources to do thesis V2 or, you know, another big deep dive on something, what kind of things are top of mind for you right now?
Oh man, another great question. I think right now I'm really curious about arts education and the research that has already been done deep diving into fostering creativity in people of all ages, and not in the context of software or tools or tech, just in the context of like the social scenarios that we need to kind of just really express ourselves and feel comfortable and safe doing so. And I wish I'd found this earlier in my undergrad career. I wish I'd taken more classes in it, but I'm currently just kind of reading everything I can and finding it really insightful. And the language and the way that they talk about creativity and like the psychology behind it is something that I hope we begin to see translated more into the tools that we use to do this work. I think that there's so much potential there. And also I think that tools in general are becoming increasingly more a method of learning about disciplines and learning about just actually interesting marketable skills that are really going to transform our world. And if the tool can like teach the discipline that it is basically enabling in a really well articulated and thoughtful way, I think that's really impactful. And I'm excited to see where we go with that. But one other last tidbit of something I'm interested in is like the history of textiles and computing. I think that is like something that hasn't been explored enough. And what we can learn also about the beginnings of like design culture from that. There's some really interesting work documenting like how the earliest textile designers were like holding critique and kind of like judging each other's creations in ways that are like eerily similar to like how designers operate today. And I don't know, it's not particularly actionable, but it's just something that fascinates me.
Super interesting. Wow.
Textiles and computing, are you talking about the impact of how kind of textile evolution might impact design work in computing technologies, or is there something more around the textiles? It's kind of the analogy, is that what's top of mind?
It's certainly that. You're spot on. It's that plus like specifically like punch cards and things like that, and even like the loom. That was kind of one of the earliest applications of computing and technology that as we see it today and as it operates. And it's interesting to see how we how we started and also just like how we reach decisions then and what we can kind of learn from that, because so many parallels, so many.
Yeah. Are there certain people or thinkers or people on Twitter who you like to read to follow these topics, or that seem to get deep on these kinds of things?
I don't feel like I've found any particularly good ones yet. I've been reading a book, back to the arts education one. Been reading a book about like I think it's called The Teaching Artist's Companion or something like that. And it's just interviews with like a whole bunch of different art teachers in different disciplines. But the textile one, that's one that I'm only finding things on like JSTOR. And that's when I know that it's like an interesting topic that has not been developed yet. It's when I can't even find like a book. And I think they do exist. I just haven't dug deep enough. But it also feels like a rich opportunity to do a little bit of more investigation work.
Yeah. Wow, I'm super interested in both of these now. This book looks great too.
It's very good. Yeah, it's very like squishy psychology based, but it felt like a good antidote after reading all these like computing books.
Yeah. And with the teaching artists and like kind of art education thread, are there like kind of practices or workshopping techniques or things that you've been reading about or finding that you think are interesting for like creative processes in tech? Is it more like process analogy, or what kind of things are you finding like translatable that people haven't really been linking yet?
Yeah. I think I'm still piecing that apart, to be honest. I think that the part that feels immediately relevant to me is the conditions that they outline as necessary for fostering creativity. When they have like a bulleted list and they're like, people need to feel like their actions will not harm the work. They need to feel safe. They need to feel acknowledged as they are. I think that these are all things that like, can literally translate into features in some ways. Not to say that they should, but I think that there is something to be said for just like trying to pinpoint exactly how the product is going to try to acknowledge all those. It probably will fail and not be able to do all of them, but just like making that attempt and trying to imagine a world where everyone just feels empowered no matter what background you're coming from to express themselves creatively is like, to me, feels like the end goal and something I really hope that we see more of.
Yeah. That's great. I love that. I love the idea. I love the idea there. I think one thing is probably launching off to a whole other session. So I don't want to. I know we're about to wrap, but when you talked about kind of the tracing paper and how that style of collaboration is interesting, I wonder if there's analogies that we could start to look at in where remix culture can kind of feed into that kind of tracing paper idea. And are there examples of, whether it's from any of the types of tools or topics we talked about, but imagine, take Google Docs and then let me remix and write my own, but have it linked to yours, so people who see yours can see mine and vice versa. Ways to sort of help us all collaborate and use sort of existing tool mechanics to launch to new ones. So, but that's whole other topic of like exploring all of those tools. So anyway, this has been great. I'm glad we did get to spend a whole hour and talk to you and learn from you and hear about all your ideas.
Such a nourishing conversation. I literally just feel like showing up in the stacks of some library and like pulling out pieces on these topics. This is really incredible. Thanks so much for sharing all of this with us and with the world.
Anytime. Yes, it's a total pleasure. Thank you guys so much. It was wonderful.
Okay. Thanks, Molly.
See ya.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right. And I see that
we got Jason here.
Jason. Welcome, Jason. Let's get Jason.
Hey, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Hey. Yep. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. So I don't know. I think you have have you been to Lunchbreak before, or you are new to Lunchbreak?
I don't know if I've been to a lunch break before, but I've definitely been to a few sessions.
Okay,
but let's assume this is my first time.
Okay, cool. So I'll give you the quick overview. Is
nothing intense.
Nothing intense. be at ease. You don't look stressed. No need to be stressed. Mishti and I, we host this lunch break every day, and basically it's noon to 2 p.m. Pacific. We hang out, and we either, we'll just be like reading Twitter together and sharing some links of interesting things, or sometimes we invite interesting people in, and then we get to kind of ask questions and learn from people's experience, whether it's sometimes writers or investors or entrepreneurs, or any kind of flavor. And so I know you've sort of been following along the highlighter service and probably a few different iterations that you've been exposed to over the years. But we've really recently, ever since I guess maybe a year ago, had started doing these kind of video interviews, and we felt a lot of energy around them. So we ended up building our own tool to help us do better versions of those. And then I think I'm particularly interested to chat with you because you're a professional fireside chatter. Is that
right? More like a side hobby, let's call it.
Okay, side hobby. That's kind of I think Mishti and I are also kind of side hobbyist fireside chatters.
It's such a fun side hobby. How did that start out for you?
Yeah, it's so I work at Amazon. My main role is essentially I help run a program that helps improve the customer and selling partner experience. But I do try to help with our peculiar culture in doing a variety of things. Two of which is, so I also serve as a mentor to our Alexa Next Stage and Techstars program. And then at times I'll help either moderate or set up these Amazon fishbowls or fireside chats with external guests. So as you can imagine, a lot of fun book authors.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so are you in the kind of Seattle headquarters area? Okay.
Yep.
Because I feel like there's a lot probably in the Amazon culture that I'm in San Francisco, and sort of a lot of our networks are Silicon Valley based. I don't think we have as much exposure to necessarily, what is the culture? What are the things that you found to be kind of unique to the culture? Things that have sort of impacted your career and sort of how you think about work. I wonder if there's anything that you can share around your experience there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The culture, it's very. It ties back, at least to Amazon, to the leadership principles. So working backwards from the customer, ownership. We have a lot of different affinity groups, which is great. So I would say, to me, the fireside chats has been a really fun part of the culture. Just getting to meet a lot of different book authors and pick their perspectives. Mm-hmm. So I think, the very first one I did, I'm trying to think back, it was, I think, January 2018, and it was with Alexis Ohanian. He came up to Seattle. We did a fun fireside chat. I think we live streamed it on social media, and we talked about his book, Without Their Permission, which was, he wrote it a few years ago about essentially the founding story of Reddit. So that's what kind of kicked it off. And then ever since then, I've just done a variety of fireside chats. So I think for me, it's interesting. The whole fireside chats process is never ending. Mm-hmm. I'm always trying to evolve the skills and the space to bring out interesting insights from these guests. Because some of these authors, you'll see them a lot on different podcasts, interview shows, things like that. So I'm always trying to balance what's that mix of things that they have talked about, but maybe there's some follow-up questions that were not disclosed, or what are some completely new insights that people have never heard of, but I think would be interesting or peculiar. So that's like the goal that I'm trying to strive towards.
That's so relatable, yeah. I feel like often before we have someone on, I go into this internet rabbit hole of like reading every single thing they've written and their whole Twitter and like every interview they've given. And then I have just so much more context than any audience member. And so there's this like balance between not skipping over that and like digging deeper sometimes, but also you don't want to prompt someone into rehashing, a story that they're used to telling. So I think, it's really interesting to sort of like jam on the art of interviewing in a sense.
I like that.
Yeah. Like what have you found? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I wonder, Jason, do you have, kind of dovetailing on that, there's oftentimes when people are going on like a book tour, they might have their talking points, their media training, and they have the key ideas they want to get out, or they sort of are comfortable. And I wonder if you have found any particularly good techniques to help get people off script, or when you want to sort of nurture them to feel more comfortable so that they're a little bit more extemporaneous. If you have, any kind of techniques that you've kind of discovered over time doing these that help with that.
Yeah, it's interesting with fireside chats because there's no blueprint or science, right? Because every human is so different. So sometimes, sometimes I'll go in. Actually, I'll take a step back. The way I framework these fireside chats is really there's two pieces that I focus on. There's the prep work, which is where a lot of the work is done, and then there's the actual chat. And the actual chat is mostly about listening and then diving deep on specific things that a speaker might have said that you go, oh, wait a minute, that was interesting. I want to peel back the onion on that, right? So taking those those pieces that I focus on, what I've then found is I'm trying to develop these frameworks to try to develop a mental model that's a through line between prep and actual chat. So the first one that I'm working on is, I call it make space for serendipity. And the second one is pursue the ungoogleable, quote unquote. And then the third one is be the student. And that ties back to listening. So I think this question to me ties back to the first framework of make space for serendipity. So I try to tackle this in two ways. And granted, in the prep phase, I take copious notes. Let's just call it a book that I'm reading. I will take a lot of handwritten notes, a lot of question marks on these pages, or why, where was this person when they wrote this? What were they thinking? What was their mindset? What was their physical location? But essentially, I try to narrow it down to two things. Broad questions, because you never know what the speaker will say, right? So they might say something super interesting that then you can follow up and dive deep with 5 questions. But the second one I found is, instead of just waiting for serendipity to happen, you almost try to evoke and create serendipity. So what I found effective is, at the beginning, usually around question 2 or 3. So the first question, I'll usually ask a pretty broad one, like what inspired you to write this book, things like that. But the second one is, I ask a very specific question, and I usually tie it to a specific page or chapter. So for example, I could say something like, oh, in chapter 2, you mentioned this. You wrote about this prose, or you mentioned this quote, but can you tell me more? Like, what were you thinking when you wrote this? Why did you decide to write this for that chapter? And then I think you start to see a little bit of magic happen in those responses. Yeah,
it's nice because it definitely anchors on the thing that they came to talk about, but then it also dives off into potentially new kind of unexplored areas. One thing I think that we do similarly, we end up, I think, like Mishti was just asking Molly, who was on in the previous hour, about kind of what she's been reading lately that she's curious about. So kind of taking people's kind of reading habits outside of their own context of what they're on script about, and helping them sort of give space to talk about other things that they're curious about or currently reading. Another kind of serendipitous.
It feels like actually a lot of the most valuable parts of the conversations that we've had with people, and the things that resonate most with audience members, are pretty similar themes in terms of questions. It's like, who were these people's mentors growing up, or like what are their values, or way more about like the emotional story behind the person than necessarily any output or work they've done. Or like DK said, like what are they curious about today? Like you want to sort of like get inside someone's brain and feel like you're getting to know them as an actual person. But yeah, I think there's something to getting there like as specifically as you can, and not just like asking people these general kind of like playbook questions of like, tell me all about your emotional life, or whatever it might be.
I will say, I think 3 recurring questions that I like a lot, and I tend to use because I feel like it does help open up the speaker, is one I like to use a lot is so learn and be curious is one of our Amazon leadership principles. So I always like to ask, how do speakers stay curious? Because you could get quite a variety of boxes, right? So for example, I think when I was talking with Ryan Holiday on it, he's a domain expert on Stoicism. So we talked, I think 20, 30 minutes in the chat, it was all about his book, Lives of the Stoics. and about stoicism and learnings, lessons, things like that. But then when we started to talk about Ryan, we actually did a dive deep into his creative process, which I found super interesting. So I recalled like three things just stick in my head from that conversation. One, Ryan consciously rereads books, the same books, but at different points of his life. So he said he read the book The Road by let me see, who was the person that wrote it? By Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah.
So he said he first read it in college, but then he reread it at the start of the pandemic, and now he has young children. So it changed his different mindset. I do that with a few books too, so I understood what he said. The second thing he said that was interesting is he not only does he read books, but he copiously takes notes for every section, every page of the books, handwritten notes, like on note cards. So he says he has buckets and buckets of thousands of note cards. So to him, it's almost like a living, breathing repository of information that he refers back to. And then the third thing is, then we started talking about like different perspectives and beliefs. And he said, he quoted, I think it was Seneca, who said, you must read like an enemy, like a spy in the enemy camp. Meaning, try to actively read things that you may not agree with or different perspectives. And he said how he did it was he likes to have 3 to 4 hour single-threaded dinner conversations with really smart people who disagree with his beliefs. And then, you know, I started asking him, well, okay, dinner conversations, are we talking about like a one-on-one or like 20 people? And he said like usually a one-on-one, a small group, super casual, sometimes at their house. And they really dive deep on like, you know, it could be different topics, business, government, things like that. Yeah, so I thought that was fascinating.
Are there any that come to mind just to help us kind of contextualize what kind, you know, like the spy and enemy camp idea? Is there, you know, is it at the granularity of a particular, like maybe it's a government policy or an economic policy, or is it kind of more broadly about political parties, or, you know, maybe a technology approach to solving self-driving? Like what's sort of the kind of narrowness or breadth of kind of the enemy camp exploration?
Yeah, I think, you know, for Ryan in our conversation specifically, he mentioned that he's had a few dinners with like Peter Thiel, who, you know, share different perspectives from him. So they would dive deep on those. I think a lot of it was about business and government, but it seems to cover quite a broad spectrum. But you want to dive deep into each of those because there's connective tissue between those, right? Yeah. So I thought that was super interesting with Ryan.
Yeah, I like the idea of trying your best at all times to steelman the opposing ideas. And so unless you can really well articulate what is great about the ideas you disagree with, I think it's hard to really credibly know if you have fully digested it. And so you even can disagree. I think you can only disagree in a healthy way if you like deeply understand and appreciate what it is. And I think this spy and enemy camp really encourages people to go down that path. So I think it's
it's definitely hard though, because it requires for someone to know and articulate precisely what their own beliefs on something are, which is, I mean, often you don't necessarily even have a formed belief on something, or it's difficult for you to kind of pin down where you might put a stake on the ground, and then even finding those people with opposing views, I think is difficult. So there's this like holy grail of having these conversations, but I find, even if I think about myself, like what's an example of a view that I hold strongly or with some enough degree of confidence that I would want, like I could go down this rabbit hole, and how would I even go about finding people that disagree with me? I feel like I am exposed to a lot of diverse ideas, but not necessarily ones that are in tension with my own beliefs, especially online, like on Twitter. That applies, I think.
I mean, that's one of the things I like about. Have you seen this service called Letters.wiki?
No.
It's a very small scale service, but it's really well done, where it's kind of two thinkers with very strong opposing views, effectively writing a series of open letters to each other. And so it's all done in a very respectful tone, you know, appreciating the best of the arguments, but explaining, you know, the opposing view or kind of the opposition to those arguments. and so it takes this idea and tries to present an online format. I think like a lot of our online tools are so quick, rapid fire, mob mentality rules. Whereas I think this one is like a slower, more considered, more like almost co-creation of media between these opposing views, which you don't really see happen a lot. So that's one tool that I've been, excited. Whenever I see something from there, I'm excited to read it because I think it helps us, further, think in this way.
Yeah, I plus one to that. That's a neat tool. I'm going to check it out afterwards. And it's interesting because in the discussion with Ryan, he ties it a lot back with Stoicism, right? And one of the Stoics in the past, I remember one of the statements was, you can only make your own beliefs and arguments stronger when you know the argument from the different perspective or opposite side. Right. So being, knowledgeable on that makes a lot of sense. So I like that a lot. Another question that I found opens up speakers well is, and this is a pretty simple one, is what's your favorite failure and what did you learn? Right. Yeah. Super interesting. You never know what people are going to get.
Yeah.
Or say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, on the, I like the things that are both like formulaic enough that they can apply to like anybody you're talking to, but also evocative enough that it really provokes a new idea instead of the like, the typical well-trodden paths. One that we use a lot is kind of what surprises you most about X, or what was most surprising about X, because I think sometimes when people are in the well-trodden paths, if they can kind of reach on the thing that they don't think about all the time, that it sort of, counterpoints into the well-trodden paths and gets people a little bit off script.
Interesting. Is there?
That's probably my favorite one. Like asking people about their surprises. I feel like I do that every single lunch break, and I stole it from my last job, which was an investment fund. But this was like the MD's favorite question to ask fund managers, like what surprised you about? Because there's a lot of information built into those answers. Like you learn about what someone's priors were, what happened, how they adjusted. So it's pretty interesting.
Do you have like a memorable example that you recall?
Ooh. Well, I was just making highlights from a session we had with Brian Tobal, who's founder of Schoolhouse. It's like micro school or schooling pods. And I really liked, I feel like he really lit up when we asked this question because it kind of uncovered this process of discovery that he had where he was like, I'm not sure if this will even work. Let's just test this idea and see what happens. Hopefully, like houses don't burn down because kids are like doing science experiments in the kitchen or whatever. But then talking about just the process of like watching parents and teachers work really closely together and like modulate their paths of action and like interaction with students based on feedback. And another thing he said was that there was a lot of like no bullying and people kind of transcended expectations. Like no one was like the kid who's like bad at math and stuck in that as opposed to a regular classroom, because there were like pods of 6 or 7 kids who got to know each other really deeply. And it was like everyone's always learning something new. It's multi-age, multi-skill classrooms. So I don't know, that's just the most recent one that comes to mind. But I think it's a good example because it sort of illustrates how this question can get people to talk about process in a way, like their own learning process about a certain topic.
Yeah.
Actually,
go ahead. No, go ahead, David. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things, Jason, that you were mentioning just previous was around the, explaining about failures as a way to get people to open up. And it reminded me of the fact that we end up talking to, oftentimes on lunch break, we'll have somebody who's building something new in the world. And so it doesn't have a failure, but I think an interesting one to explore is like, if we fast forward a few years and this thing proves to have failed, why would it have failed? And so it gets us kind of like brainstorming about like what could go wrong, not because we want to dwell on it, but we want to be like aware of the risks and aware of, because then you can start to like work toward mitigating those risks. So I think sometimes, using failure historically sounds like it's been productive for you. And I think I would also just highlight the fact that we sometimes use failure, predictions as a way to get people, get people off script and get people really thinking through problems and sort of being kind of more real about about what they have versus, your instincts might be to be more salesy sometimes.
I like that approach because it's a good framework on working backwards from a future state. And you usually work backwards from what you want, but this kind of switches it. You want to work backwards from what do you want to avoid almost, which then you can dive deep into product experiences, UX or customer issues, things like that. I like that one. I might borrow that.
Yeah, go for it. One place I think is really effective is early stage entrepreneurs working on like a marketplace. It's kind of like, okay, is this going to be supply constrained or demand constrained? And then they usually already have an intuition. Oh, this is probably supply constrained. Okay, so like, what is the kind of supply that is going to see this value prop and they're not going to believe that it's good for them? Like, so why is it going to be hard to grow that side? Like, what are going to be the challenges? And hopefully from that process, you actually realize, oh, we don't want to go after these people because the value prop is not going to resonate with them. But the people that it really does work for, we're just going to get deeper and deeper here because like, it's just not for everybody. It's really focused. So I think that kind of early marketplace supply demand dynamic, like which one is out of balance, and then how do we find the one that's most important and most out of balance, most challenging, most risk for failure, and then kind of figure out ways to brainstorm or navigate around potential failures there.
Yeah, it's like you're opening up their mental models to peek into their process of thinking, which I think is actually the most interesting, right? Especially a question like that with the demand and supply of a marketplace, because a lot of times there usually isn't a clear answer. So it's okay. How do you think about that? Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I will say one question I found interesting with book authors is asking what was the inspiration for the book cover art? Because
that's a good one.
I'll give you two examples. One, so we did a fireside chat with a poet named NQ, and this is his book, Inquire Within. So super interesting, right? Like there's a lot of poems in it. There's some illustrations. There's some blank pages. But we learned two things. This question opened up two things. First, he said, this was his answer. He said, obviously, there's like the bird flying away and then the bird on the branches. But he said if you turn it sideways, it's a brain. And that's what he wanted this book to evoke, was both sides of your brain, right?
Yeah.
And then, he started just jamming on it because he was really excited. Because, I think authors spend a lot of time designing their books.
Yeah.
And then at the last minute, he's like, okay, I never said this to anyone. He said, only two other people know that this exists. I think it was his fiance, and then I think his business manager and friend. But he said this book has a secret message and Easter egg.
Wow.
In it. And he said, if you find it and tell him, he will confirm or deny. So that was interesting. I think we had a lot of people looking for it. Yeah.
That's epic. That's so cool.
Yeah, more people should do Easter eggs in their creative work because I think it makes it almost like it draws in the collaboration of like, let's get a community of people all hunting for the egg or discussing, did we see the egg? Is this the egg? Did we find it? Is there something else here? Are there more available that are undiscovered? I remember this used to be a common thing. I think a lot of Microsoft's desktop software used to have like I remember some early version of Excel, you could actually, well, maybe somewhere in the first decade, they had like 3D. You could almost play like Wolfenstein 3D or Doom within Excel, and then it had like rolling credits of. I may be sort of piecing together a few different Easter eggs. This was like from more than 20 years ago. But then they would have like the rolling credits of everybody who worked on building Excel would show up there, and it was kind of just this like moment of delight, thing that you would talk about, thing that you would like. If we had Twitter at that time, we would have been screenshotting and sharing videos and sharing these moments of delight. And I think encouraging more creative work to include Easter eggs feels like it's a pattern that is not as used as I would expect.
I agree to that. I love Easter eggs. And I think, like you asked earlier about company culture. I feel like, as companies grow, that lore and history, a lot of it, can become Easter eggs and things. And they're exciting for employees or other people to talk about. Super. I mean, look at all the Pixar and Disney Easter eggs, like across the universes of movies and content. Super fun.
Yeah. Do you have
Yeah.
any favorites from the Disney World that come to mind?
Oh, let's see. I'm a big Pixar fan, specifically Toy Story. So
Oh yeah.
Mm.
anything that like alludes to Buzz, I'm a big fan of. Yeah. Do you have any favorites?
Um, I I am trying to think. I know that the thing that comes to mind when you say this. I don't even know if you'd call it an Easter egg, but have you seen these sequences of like dance or movement that maybe showed up in a cartoon in the 1950s and then showed up again in a cartoon like 30 years later?
Oh, interesting. I haven't seen it.
This is amazing. I'm not sure if it's part of like it's like an animation technique that's borrowed or improved or adopted from a previous film. But and there's tons of these online. I'm sure I'll search and find an example and share a link in the chat. But there's these examples of like uh, a certain maybe it's a bear who's dancing and moving and grabbing something and then spinning and moving over that way. And then you see the same thing, but it's a mouse doing the same set of moves, and you just watch them side by side, and you're like, this is like, this is obviously related, and I want to know why and who did that, and what's the reasoning and what's the connection here? What are they trying to communicate in that connection?
Oh, that's fascinating. Because there's different levels and tiers of Easter eggs, right? And some of them, there's YouTube videos with millions of views and everyone knows about it. Like, oh, Aladdin's magic carpet appeared in this Pixar movie. But yeah, those smaller ones, it's almost like a secret within that group and community. That's super interesting. I like that a lot.
Yeah. I found a Laughing Squid article with just a quick search. So I don't know if this is the best one, but it's called How Disney Recycled the Exact Same Movement Sequences in Their Early Animated Films.
Oh, neat.
They use the term,
go, sorry.
They use the term recycled, which to me sounds a little more like cost oriented maybe. But I noticed it's certainly like very expensive to produce these things. But you see Snow White, Frozen, and Toy Story is one of these videos, which seems to have, they show kind of the side-by-side ones. I actually wish we had our screen sharing stuff up. I could demo it right here. I'm halfway down the page, but yeah, really, really cool videos worth taking a look.
Oh, that's neat. And it's a nice hat tip because we're talking about creative builders, right? So it's a nice hat tip for the current or younger talent to do it for the people who came before. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Right. I love any of those hat tips actually, especially when they're across like genre or across like kind of like tributes to the greats. So I don't know if you follow jazz music at all, but it's very common in jazz music to like quote a passage from something that was like performed, years ago, and it's sort of like maybe like Charlie Parker has a riff, and then like you're doing something, and you want to sort of incorporate a famous.
I posted in chat about this.
Oh, you did.
Most sampled beat of all time, I think.
Oh,
it just reminded me of like tracing the lineage of a creative idea throughout time.
Oh yeah.
What you were saying, DK, about the dancing.
I think I heard I may have heard like I'm gonna say maybe like a Planet Money or some NPR podcast where they actually do. I think it's the Can I Get an Amen that you're referencing here.
Yeah.
From resampled music. There's another one that's kind of that hat tip culture is which I've been kind of thinking about recently is you're familiar with kind of the Hamilton play what's it called, the mixtape?
I think so.
So Hamilton musical, then Miranda. Then people made like this Hamilton mixtape, which is people redoing, kind of performing the hits from Hamilton redone. But then there's other people who've built these like playlists of like the Hamilton songs and all of the like pieces that are borrowed from, like there's a lot of stuff from like early like 80s hip hop that must just be in Lin-Manuel Miranda's ear and head. And so when he writes these songs, he's doing them, but you can look at it, it's like a very obvious, very specific hat tip and reference, but it pulls on from so many sources. So the final product is like, it's both a synthesis of everything, but it's also something entirely new. It's not just a bunch of samples. It's actually an entirely new creative work, but it's just so directly connected. It feels like, the standing on the shoulders of giants kind of phrase comes to mind, right? It's just
Yeah,
so perfectly, in that lineage and kind of an
right.
appreciation.
It's
I
kind of
love
all
that.
back to the process theme. Like the more we dig into whether it's someone's decision-making process or creative process or like past influences into their current thinking, I think that is the most like enlightening and interesting for people to hear about because that really gets you inside someone's brain in a way that they probably haven't talked about before.
Yeah, it opens up a whole lot because then you start talking about their inspiration, and then they start
Hmm.
talking about their childhood dreams and their
Right.
experiences in fifth grade and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Actually, I was wondering that for you, so it's actually a good
Yeah, I was
kind
gonna
of
ask too.
launching off point for that.
Turn it on you.
When 2018, you started kind of the fireside chat fishbowl thing. Was that something that you kind of decided on your own that you wanted to do, or somebody had suggested it might be something that the broader Amazon org wanted to do? And sort of, are there areas from your childhood that point to your interest or likely success in this kind of endeavor?
Oh yeah. So the program itself existed long before for me, even before I joined.
Mm-hmm.
So I basically just raised my hand and said, "Oh, hey, I think this one would be a fun one." And then a lot of things kind of worked out, and I ended up moderating it with Alexis. I think
Mm-hmm.
the more interesting backstory with Alexis is when I was before Amazon, I was working in the media advertising industry in Los Angeles, and then I was part of a nonprofit organization called Think LA at that time, and we threw a variety of different events, different speakers talking about like internet trends, mobile trends, things like that. So we actually
Mm-hmm.
did an event with Alexis, and he talked about internet culture and social communities, and Reddit and things like that. So that's how we first got connected.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, with this, I was like, "Oh wait, Alexis has a book. He's a super interesting and
Right.
compelling human being, and I
Yeah.
think he'd be a lot of fun." I wondered, can we make this happen? And then a few months later, and we did. So that's how it ended up happening. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Nice. And it sounds like you already sort of had that relationship with Alexis. So have you mostly been developing new relationships through the Fireside Chat series, or sort of have you had a stable of relationships already established that you're pulling on?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of both. Like the Ryan Holiday one was, we did ours in I think October of last year, so that one's fairly recent. But he does have a new children's book out right now,
Hmm.
"The Boy Who Would Be King," which is essentially a children's book about the story of Marcus Aurelius, the
Mm-hmm.
Roman emperor. So that's an exciting one. I'm diving into it right now. It's a quick, fun read. But yeah, so it's a combination of both. Yeah.
And for you, were you taking like talents you had developed? Like, have you had a YouTube channel or a podcast, or is there something from your history that kind of points to your kind of where you got to cut your teeth on practicing this kind of stuff?
I wish I had a great YouTube channel before all this. Still TBD. I would say, like when I was helping out with the nonprofit, I would help moderate or chair some of these events. So
Mm-hmm.
that gave me some experience doing this. But I think it was always something I've been super interested in, right? Because, you listen to a lot of podcasts and sometimes you'll come away saying, oh, I wish the moderator asked about that question.
Yep.
So I was like, okay, is this something that I could potentially do? So when this opportunity came up, I was like, oh yeah, let me try for it.
Mm.
So I guess the feedback's been pretty good. So I'm super,
Yeah.
super.
With
Are
all the
there
creative tools that are out today, it seems like there's more opportunity than ever for people with kind of
Mhm.
the inclination, skill set, appetite to experiment and dabble with that. I mean, podcasting feels like it's been around for 20 years, but has really hit stride in the last, call it 5 years, really strongly. So, do you think it's something maybe in a future life would you build a new show for yourself, or how do you think about sort of both? Because I know it's a little bit like it's ancillary to your actual professional work today, but there's some coupling there. So I wonder sort of how you think about it sort of across time.
Yeah, it's something. It's a skill that I want to keep developing, and it's an experience I want to keep growing because number one, I think it helps me explore new ideas. It helps me disconfirm my beliefs, And then, it's a great way to retain your childlike sense of wonder as we all grow older.
Yeah.
So I get asked that question a lot, like, why don't you start your own podcast or YouTube channel, things like that. So I've started to dabble with it but with a newsletter, and I'm trying out like a couple of different formats. Like some of these fireside chats through video, I'll post. I'm testing a text-based Q&A format because I've gotten a lot of feedback that that's what people like to read quickly, like when they're on their mobile phone in the morning. But I found that, obviously, like we're having a conversation here where we can dive in and out, but the text-based, it's very formulaic.
Right.
I'm trying exactly. I'm trying to figure out how can we create that serendipity through text. I haven't figured it out yet.
Have you seen the stuff that Sarhar Bhakti has been doing?
I don't think so.
So I don't know if these may start in a more live format and then he publishes them in kind of a blog style format. I'm actually going to find a link right now, but I know he had a recent one with Semel Shah, where it's kind of an interview style, like it would be a fireside chat, but the actual published thing is not a podcast or a YouTube video, but it's a blog post that I'm not certain of the full process, but I get the sense that it's structured that way. Here I'm pulling up. That's Sarhar Bhakti's Substack. Actually, I shared this Curious Expeditions. That's your main Substack, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I shared that one, but then above that I shared the Sarhar Bhakti one where he was chatting with Semel, and it's kind of that text-based interview format that that you're kind of. I think is that kind of what you're alluding to, or did you have something else in mind?
Yeah, I'm experimenting. I did one with Grace Gong. She hosts her own podcast called Smart Venture Podcast. So she talks to a lot of like interesting top performers, right? And what are your thoughts? Do you like, because sometimes I find myself, I like to read. Like I will take 45 minutes and just read the whole block. Yeah. But other times it's like, I understand people are writing down their thoughts, so there's less room for interesting, sometimes, side conversations. What are your thoughts? What do you think about the two different formats?
Yeah, so for creation, I mean, this is a topic that we seem to talk about again and again, but the idea of writing something and publishing it when you kind of click final publish feels like the barrier for sort of the certainty of your confidence in those ideas and the certainty of the structure of what you've created at that point feels more like, kind of in stone in a sense. And so I think as, from a creation process, I kind of like lighter weight formats than blogging, let's say. And that can be, like a whiteboard with some friends, or a virtual whiteboard with some friends kind of discussing something, or, even like over text, like, I'm a member of like some WhatsApp groups where we do a lot of like, we don't even call it like idea generation. We're just like hanging out, jamming, just kind of like you would with friends. But then sometimes like a nugget of something cool comes up and you're like, oh, actually, this is the thing that I want to take to the world. And it feels like almost any idea that I would want to publish in some form I can almost always trace the lineage to something that happened in private. And I don't think so much of ideas as like, this is my idea, this is your idea, but I try to use the phrasing that I presented in private, and I try to just like adapt that to a public format, just to try to make sure that everybody feels okay. I'm not if you like had some great message and then I copy paste it into a tweet, that feels kind of cheesy, right? But so I try to like use my version of it, but it almost, it must be that 60 or 80% of any tweet I write, I first, started over DM or started over, like a WhatsApp or Signal group or something. But then I also have noticed this behavior, and I was trying to find the specific source of this behavior, but I noticed a guy who was doing these, they were called like screenshot interviews, I think. And what he did is do you see these ones?
I think so.
Like DMing somebody that he wanted to interview, and it's just like a back and forth text style exchange, but he says like, okay, we're gonna like curate this and publish it, I guess. I'm not sure how much preamble he gives, but then he has like 4 panels, and it's just like a quick, rapid fire Q&A with a person that people might be interested to hear from, and he kind of uses DM as a way to help get a story out and get it told. And I think because it's DM, just the visual of it feels, it's supposed to be light. It doesn't have to be perfectly phrased. And if like the spelling is wrong or there's like an extra emoji, it's kind of okay. You get it because the screenshot says we're DMing. Like, it's cool, right? So I think there's like a lot of those types of things. Like when I think about a Substack, it feels like I have to sort of really present my thinking in a more structured, final way. And I like a lot of the lightweight stuff just for myself. I think there's like different formats for different uses. But what about you? How do you think about sort of the seriousness and the places where you can sort of be more playful versus the places where you feel like you have to be more kind of considered?
With every fireside chat that I do prefer to have a pre-call with the guest or speaker. And, it could be a week before, it could be a day before. At least a 15 or 30 minutes just to get to know each other. But sometimes I do feel like sometimes that becomes the interesting conversation.
Right.
Yeah, we always struggle with that.
Yeah.
I'm sometimes told in the pre-call, we've sometimes gotten into it. I was like, no, this is super interesting, but we've got to not talk about this. Let's just talk operational logistics. Because we don't want to burn all the good stuff right here.
Exactly.
not to ever run out, but
so that part's interesting. But like the video versus the text, I still do have that same sense that you mentioned, where if I'm going to post a Q&A text-based on Substack, I feel like it has to be perfect. Every word, every grammar, punctuation, phrase has to be perfect. But like, in this chat that we're doing now, it's so much more casual. I do one thing I find difficult is bringing forth the authentic authentic voice or emotions through text.
Mm-hmm.
I know you can play around with GIFs and photos and stuff like that, but it's not the same for me. I think sometimes with text based, I take it too seriously instead of just getting down to like the fun part, while also balancing. It's interesting. Like I'm trying to balance detailed responses, but also being concise in text.
Yeah,
that's really hard.
I wonder if there's some way to signal that, because like this theme has now came up in the previous hour, but Mishti is always writing in lowercase with no punctuation, and I'm always like capitalizing everything and trying to get it right, and I don't always get it right, but like my instinct is to try to like capitalize the sentence properly, and she's like, no, we're just gonna roll with it. And I wonder if there's something just in that slight distinction. Like, what if you were to post a Substack that was not allowed to use any capitalization or any punctuation? You had to use a new
that
line.
Might hurt my brain. I don't know if I could do that even. But it's interesting to think about, like stylistically playing with the format of text. Sort of what you're getting
people, at. Yeah, it's a signal that like I'm just dashing off some thoughts. Like, don't take it too seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that culture? Does it grow up from texting? Is that kind of, if you had to pick where that comes from?
Probably. Yeah, I think so.
For me,
but I'm also thinking. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was just saying, I'm also thinking like, what cues like this do we three use when we're interviewing people? Because essentially, you're saying like, what kind of gestures or verbal tics or whatever can be useful in making people feel like sessions are casual and warm instead of super scripted. So, I mean, a lot of it is just smiling and listening really carefully and the way that you comport yourself. But I don't know, like, what parts of those can be trained or paid special attention to make sessions even better.
Yeah, that one is tough. I do think, like on the whole typing and texting, for me, the Twitter threads have almost like exploded. I feel like in the past year, where I'm just reading 14, 26, 56 lines. And I found those a pretty interesting experience. I like writing them because it forces you to be concise, which, I think is good for time and place. But yeah, I think that's interesting. One thing I will say with my like as I prep for some of these fireside chats, I tend to, within a 60-minute chat, let's say, I tend to have 7 to 12 questions ready just for back pocket, because you never know how the conversation is going to go, right?
Yeah.
But I found the best ones are when I really just end up asking 4 questions, and then we're just like, oh my gosh, tell me more.
Right.
Yeah, things like that. Yeah. Those are the best.
It's great. I think we've gone through an evolution with how we do, broadly, these video sessions that we record. Our very first ones were very planned and kind of, I'd almost call it like a little formal and a little too high stress. Like we would get some author, and Mishti and I would have like a Google Doc in the back where we'd have like, okay, now we're going to read the bio, then we're going to hand it off to this person, then we're going to do this. And we sort of had so much structure to it that like it was, kind of on a schedule. I mean, and it was just like very different than like what we're doing now. And what we're doing now actually feels so much easier and better to get like the real stories. Whereas like if you start a session and you read somebody's bio, you're kind of signaling like, this is the serious moment. Let's all do this serious talking discussion thing. And I think if you're just like, people show up and you're like, hey, what's up? Hey, no worries. We're just going to hang and have fun. I think it creates more space, lowers the stress and creates more space for like the good stuff to come out.
Yeah.
And while I was saying that, or while you were telling that before, it was making me think we should turn the failures question on you. So have you ever been in a fireside chat where something has really gone off the rails or gotten into like an awkward area, and were you able to recover? Sort of what were the techniques or kind of approaches you were able to use to sort of get things back on track?
Yeah, that's good. Like, what are disaster management techniques live?
That is a good one. Knock on wood. Granted, I probably haven't done that many fireside chats, but nothing disastrous yet. Hopefully, the next one doesn't happen. I will say, there might be times where I ask a question and I'm expecting a pretty like unique story, but then the response you get is pretty like one-worded. And you're like, okay, that's interesting. Where should I go from here? Right.
Yeah.
So I think when that happens, what I like to do is I like to prep some backup questions that I call like quick fire rounds.
Yep.
So then you could quickly go, okay, let me ask you a series of just 5 quick fire questions.
Yeah.
To try to get them to open up. And these could be really simple. Like, what's a favorite book that you read recently, right? Like super simple questions, I feel like can help tee those up. And then based on how those answers are going, then you can open it up with a deeper follow-up question. And
so with the one-word answers that kind of get it into that stuck point, is that a guest kind of trying to be difficult, or are they just sort of, they don't have much to say there and that's kind of their way of signaling that?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer behind that. I think my hypothesis is probably a mixture of those two. Yeah. I'm trying to recall an exact question where that might have happened.
And then, well, when you hear that, and then you mentioned you kind of maybe transition into something quick fire, do you call it out so that everybody knows that you're kind of moving into this new, okay, now we're gonna start the quick fire round, and do you sort of introduce that's where you're going, or do you kind of just like get into it and it becomes clear that that's kind of what it's all about?
I used to do that early on, but what started to happen is they weren't quick fire. They were actually some of the longest questions. So I said, okay, I should just stop doing that.
That's funny.
Right. Reminds me of Harry. Do you know Harry Stebbings from the 20-Minute VC?
Yep.
So he actually launches into a quick fire round. He always announces it, and he's really good at keeping his guests on schedule. I feel like he's got like the clock or something. He's like, no, come on, let's go, moving on.
Yeah. What are what have been your strategies for transitioning when you definitely want to transition from one topic to the next, or you're doing like time management or stuff? How do you handle that in a fluid way in conversation?
Yeah, time management is interesting. So this is where the prep comes in. That's important, right? Because I need to know, does the speaker have a hard stop? Some of them do, so I know they need to go. If they don't, I'm actually okay moving like 30 minutes over, because sometimes on these like Tim Ferriss podcasts where they go like 3 hours. Sometimes those
Yeah.
are super fascinating. So I'm okay with that. So if there's an option to make it limitless, I'll take that option. The other part is what I found effective is once the speaker says something, I try to just quickly follow up with a comment or tie in to something that we talked about earlier. So like, for example, like in one of the latest ones with Ryan, I'll tie it when he mentioned rereading and he mentioned a couple books, I'll just give a quick statement on that I reread The Art of War every couple years. And I may learn like one thing new. Cause that actually tends to open that person up to make a comment on your comment, which can just dovetail into a whole nother section. So I find that interesting. Cause then I learned like Ryan was a big Art of War fan as well. And how he thought, how those learnings tied in with Stoicism, which was fascinating.
Right. So you get kind of cross-pollination from kind of various areas of thought, various creative works that you can kind of, you guys can bridge together, and that itself becomes more context.
Yeah. Who are the best question askers in your life that you know personally, or like other interviewers that you respect?
I think Tim Ferriss does a great job in creating that very casual, personal environment. Guy Raz does a great job with. I think what I learned from listening to him was the question sequencing of interesting, and that's how I came up with the let's start broad, open it up a little bit, see where it goes. But if I need to force serendipity, let me ask this specific question. So that's where I kind of drew lines from that. Jason Calacanis, I think, with angel investing and entrepreneurship, I like how he does a lot of follow-up questions, like very pointed. Tell me about this. Oh, you made this statement. I think
let's pause on Jason for a moment, because I think he's interesting in that he, I would sort of describe his style as kind of I don't know, maybe a little bit abrupt, or like, he's not afraid to like pull punches and kind of put somebody on potentially defensive. And so I think a lot of the people that you mentioned, sounds like your style. I think our style is usually pretty open, collaborative, but we may not really get some things that Jason is able to get. So have you sort of thought about ways to probe maybe a little bit more aggressively in sort of what, do you sort of calibrate your own push and pull relative to kind of what you see maybe from a great interviewer like Jason?
Yeah, I think, if the speaker says something interesting and it is not in my prepared, list of questions, I will try to probe. And I think this is where the art of the art and science piece comes in, because you want to see how they react, especially like in person makes it much easier, right? Video cameras can be a little bit tough, but sometimes like the mixed reactions I get is the speaker will have a very quick follow-up to it, like because they're excited about it and they want to dive deeper. Sometimes I'll get a long pause because the speaker is really thinking about how they want to say it, or how to tie those different thoughts. So it really, I say my response depends on the response I'm getting, or the signals I'm getting. Yeah, which makes it tough, right?
Yeah. One of the other ones that also has that style that kind of I've listened to with admiration, but I don't feel like I've ever quite adopted it, is do you know Andrew Warner from Mixergy?
No.
So I'm not even sure if he's still doing it. I remember we used to listen to his podcast like, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago. Actually, now that I'm looking at his website, it looks like he's still doing it. I haven't been as close to it as a listener recently, but he has a very aggressive style where he gets all kinds of new information out, because he just makes statements and then tries to get like the guest to agree or disagree or clarify. And it's a technique that I've seen him use. It doesn't feel natural to kind of our style, at least the way that Mishti and I usually do these things. But it does surface interesting stuff. So I wonder if there are ways. I always think of people like Andrew Warner, Mixergy, and I think Jason Calacanis has some of this. Are there ways to like adapt some of our kind of more open, collaborative, curious style with a little bit more anchor on an idea and kind of, really encourage somebody to pick a side to help surface new information in the world, or kind of help get people, to share something that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, they wouldn't otherwise feel like it's the right place for it, but you kind of make space that it's like kind of okay to talk about these things that might otherwise be either, awkward or taboo subjects.
That is interesting. Yeah, I feel like the three of us, based on this conversation, we share that more casual listening type of conversational aspect to our chats. From my perspective, I would say do what's most natural for you, because like the best fireside chats or podcasts or interviews is when it's truly a two-way dialogue, right? And you're getting to hear, as the listener, both sides. Because the people will either be similar or different, things like that. So that's what I found most effective. So I think the cons to that is maybe I might not like probe as much on certain things, but I think by creating hopefully a connection with the speaker, then they'll open up. That's the route I try to go to. Yeah.
I think that's kind of where our instincts lie too. So yeah, I do think it's kind of something that we probably all share. And I noticed I'm noticing the time, we're already almost at the end of the hour. And so another meta that we could talk about is the wrap up.
Oh yeah, I like that.
Was that a nice transition to the wrap? So we do often try to keep on these schedules, and I wonder if there are one of the things that I would say that we've learned that has worked well, at least for our style, is that when we want to wrap, we first like lay the anchor that we're going to wrap, like I just did a moment ago. But then we don't want to end on the anchor. We want to actually create a little more space so that we can ask one final question. Sometimes we have a question from the audience, or sometimes we have our own question prepared, and then we can sort of ask that as a way to make it not feel like we're rushing the end. So I wonder if that's something you've explored, that idea, or you kind of maybe if you do that organically, or kind of how else you might think about doing kind of the wrap or closure.
Yeah, I usually will say, okay, will be our final question or final two questions. Sometimes I do have the habit, if something really interesting is said, I will just keep following up. But yeah, I do try to close it with a final question, and then any last thoughts from the speaker is usually how I do it. Yeah.
And do you have your own canned question that's your final question, or your canned, maybe not the right word, but like your trademark or calling card final question, or do you kind of make up your final question depending on sort of the flow of what's happened?
I'm experimenting with both. I will say if I have a final question, it will usually be the inspiration to the book cover art, because it's very lighthearted and something new. If I ask that earlier, then I'll usually ask it if it's an audience question, or just something I picked up from a recent comment. Yeah.
Yeah. We reference a podcast that we like. Do you know Patrick O'Shaughnessy, Invest Like the Best? Yep. So he has this calling card question: what's the kindest thing anyone has ever done for you? And it's both like unique to him, but also, it's platform general enough that it can apply to anybody. So it's a really nice wrap-up question. So ours, we actually, we can ask you a wrap-up question. We sometimes prepare people with it, but we sometimes leave it out in the open. But sort of, what's the thing on your mind that you're most curious about these days? What are the areas that could be super serious? It could be philosophical. It could be, short-sighted about a new restaurant that you want to try tonight for dinner. It could be, the kind of the meaning of the universe. So really, really open. Don't feel like it has to be one thing or the other. But what are the things sort of in your mind that maybe we haven't talked about that you're most curious about?
Yeah. There's a lot I tend to be curious about, so I try to focus more, but I'll choose two that I'm diving into right now. Number one is actively scheduling my time so that I can wander more, specifically in nature. So my wife and I, we have a 12-year-old dog, and we take her out on walks in the morning and night. And what we used to do was we used to each listen to our separate podcasts on these walks. And then we said, you know what, let's be fully present and just enjoy the nature around us. And I will say, like, it's been eye-opening. Like, we notice plants, birds, paintings, things around us that we've never seen before. So every walk is like a new experience now that we look forward to. So that's been nice. And it's almost been a replacement, because our favorite thing to do is travel to a new city, and the first 24 hours literally just walk anywhere. No map, no agenda.
Yeah.
And we're not doing that now. But so we're working to do that locally. So that's one. The other one is I am really interested in the whole crypto NFT space. I find it super fascinating on just the whole concept of ownership. Digital art, I think, is super interesting. I think it's going to be a Cambrian explosion of creativity. So NFTs, super interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Those are both, nature and NFTs are things that I think we also
both care a lot
share
about
interest
those.
in. We're always in nature, and tomorrow we actually are having an NFT discussion at Lunchbreak. So if you do want, feel free to come by. We'd love to have you again. This has been super fun, super educational for us. Just a blast having you on. So thanks for spending the time with us.
Yeah, likewise. Really enjoyed it. And I love what you all are doing. So keep raising the bar.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay.
See ya.
Take care.